All right, let's go ahead and get started. This morning, the first thing we're going to start with is weighted average cost of capital.
WACC.
So up to this point in the real estate finance course, the thing that we have focused the most on is looking at how much effectively our loan cost is going to be. Thus, we focused almost exclusively on this whole notion of effective cost of borrowing and the lender's yield. Because probably one of the most important things that you can understand from a borrower's perspective is what your true cost of borrowing is going to be on whatever loan that you potentially obtain or whatever sort of financial arrangement that you have with your lender. Well, debt is only one side of that piece, okay? The other side is the equity side in terms of the dollar amount that you put in as an investor into a project. Now, in the ideal, perfect world for a lot of developers, they want to put in as little money or almost maybe even no money of their own up front in the deal. Practically speaking, you know, while that can happen, does happen, most developers are still going to, or most investors are still going to have to put in some sort of an equity contribution to get a more traditional sort of bank loan to invest in a property. And that dollar amount is referred to as their sort of their equity. So what we do with weighted average cost of capital is to combine those two different sources, or actually multiple sources of capital, and figure out what our true overall cost is going to be for a particular project. Therefore, we know what sort of a rate of return that we have to get on the project in order to not only pay back our debt, but also sufficiently pay back ourselves in terms of the equity that we're putting into the project, okay? Now, normally, historically, our cost of debt is cheaper than our cost of equity. And the thought process there is obviously it's cheaper to borrow money, thus we tend to gravitate toward, let's borrow as much money as we possibly can from a traditional lender, put in as little of our own money as possible, but try to magnify the rate of return on that equity investment as much as we possibly can through the use of that financial leverage, which we're going to be talking about. So let's just sort of start off and kind of look at the components of this. And the way that I tend to do this, and I mean, it's pretty consistent with how most people do this, but at the same time, it may be a little bit different. But I tend to look at the overall return, or you could call it simply the rate of return on a project is equal to effectively your cost of debt times the percentage debt in the overall deal structure added to your cost of equity multiplied by effectively the percentage of equity in a deal. Now, you can also refer to this cost of equity as being your return on equity, which would be the kind of more common sort of vernacular to probably use to describe it. The formula is really simple in the sense that what you're doing is you're sort of saying, okay, for any given project on a very basic, simplistic level, you are borrowing a certain dollar amount and you are putting in a certain dollar amount of your own money into the deal. So let's just sort of start off with a very kind of simple, standard, normal deal, and that would be where we borrow 80%, okay? And you can also sort of think of this as being your loan-to-value ratio, all right? So we borrow 80%, so 80% debt, and our cost of debt would effectively be what is the interest rate that we're paying on that debt. Now, for the purposes of this calculation, I mean, you can look at this from a variety of perspectives. I mean, this would be kind of your all-in, theoretically, your all-in cost of that sort of lender's yield or effective cost of borrowing, you know, that sort of thing. It's sort of like, what are all of my sort of financing costs expressed as an annual sort of percentage? And so let's just say that our total cost of debt might be 7.5%. All right. Then we get over here on the equity side. Well, automatically, if we're putting in 80% debt, that means how much equity we have to put in? 20%. So obviously it's got to total up to be 100% altogether. Now, at this point, and this is where it begins to be kind of, you know, really interesting, is what you're normally left with. These are typically going to be kind of the three givens, if you will, because you pretty much know your lender in terms of what the cost of debt is going to be. You pretty much know what the deal structure is going to be in terms of the percentage debt, percentage equity. But what you're sort of left with is what sort of overall rate of return is the project itself going to throw off, and then what sort of return on your equity that you're putting into the deal, what is that going to be? Now, normally, this overall rate of return, another way of sort of thinking about it, is this could very well be a cap rate, okay? But most of the time, it is going to be just strictly what is the return that the project itself is throwing off, okay? And so that, let's just, to keep things simple, let's say that the overall project is throwing off a 10% rate of return. So what you've got to do in this particular case, assuming the project is throwing off a 10% annualized rate of return, you've got to back solve for what your cost of equity is going to be, okay? Or your return on equity. And that percentage is, in essence, what you're receiving as the investor, okay, in this particular deal. Does that make sense? Now, without actually doing the math, just kind of looking at this, what would you expect this number to be? Would you expect it to be higher or lower or the same as this overall rate of return?
Okay.
Much higher, okay, significantly higher. Because what's actually happening here is, if you want to sort of look at it like this, the project itself is generating this 10% rate of return, but for 80% of that project, you're only having to actually pay back 7.5%, leaving you with the remainder to keep for your equity. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay? And your equity percentage, in terms of the amount that you contribute to the project, is only 20%. So the rate of return that you're going to probably get here, or the return on equity that you're going to get here, is going to be something substantially greater than 10%. So let's back solve it, figure it out. Now the easiest way to back solve it is to kind of break it into component parts. So what I would do is typically take that 7.5%, multiply it by 80%, and what I end up with here is 6%. Okay, it's by doing the math. Okay, everybody get that? All right, so what does that leave us with? 4%. Well, that doesn't mean that our return on equity is 4%. It means the product of our return on equity times 20% is 4%. So if we back solve and take the 4% divided by the 20%, what do you get? Oops. Okay, so you actually end up with return on equity or cost of equity of 20%, because 20% basically times 20% would equal 4%. All right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right? So now, so what that means is that for every dollar that we put into the project of our own money, every single year we would get, theoretically, a 20% return on that money that we have invested, the equity that we have invested. So technically, over 5 years, we would have paid ourselves back our original investment. Okay, this is of course ignoring taxes and other cost, but just from the standpoint of looking at what is our return on equity, this would be it. Now, normally, the number that we use to calculate sort of this rate of return on our equity is going to be our before tax cash flow. Okay, that the property throws off, which we've been through. So let's kind of go through and kind of show us how do we get down to some of these numbers. If you remember, potential gross income minus vacancies and collection losses plus other income gives us effective gross income. We subtract out total operating expenses, which gives us net operating income. We subtract out our annual debt service, which gives us our before tax cash flow. Okay, does that look familiar? It should. Okay. So basically what we're saying is that the number that we get here for this before tax cash flow, that is the number that we're using to calculate the return effectively on our equity. Okay, whatever dollar amount that we get here for this before tax cash flow, whereas the annual debt service, that's really effectively our total cost of debt, okay, and what our debt is costing us. And then our net operating income is the overall sort of return the project is generating. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Okay. Now, so if, to keep things simple, I'm just going to sort of pull these numbers just to kind of illustrate the concept and try to keep it as straightforward as possible. So if the project is yielding an overall 10% rate of return, then what this means, if we kind of go back to our very fundamental sort of ERV model, our income, our net operating income is $10,000, and the overall rate of return we said was 10%. That means that the overall value of the project is $100,000. Does that make sense, everybody? Mm-hmm. Okay. So what we're saying is that out of the income that the property is generating of the 10,000, effectively, we could say that 80% is being eaten up with our cost of debt. Now, here's another way of sort of looking at it. We could also sort of view it a little bit differently. Okay? We could look at this as being our annual debt service is $6,000 and our before tax cash flow is $4,000. Okay, if we sort of try to split it up equally between the two, all right, because effectively if we had the $100,000, 6% of that would be $6,000. 4% of 100,000 would be 4,000. Okay, and so in essence, that could be our before tax rate of return or before tax cash flow. Now, given that our investment in this particular deal we are saying our equity is 20% or $20,000 total, whereas our debt is 80,000. And so, in essence, our debt of 80,000, if we're paying 7.5% on that debt, that gives us the 6,000. And if we're paying effectively a 20% rate of return on our equity, that gives us 4,000. We add those two together, that gives us the 10,000 overall. The 10,000 overall divided by the 100,000 would give us the 10% rate of return. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, what begins to be interesting on this is this whole idea of what we're going to sort of term financial leverage. And this is the whole thing of magnifying your return on equity because your cost of debt is lower than your cost of equity. Okay? And so what you're able to do is basically, this is the sort of thing that where, let's say, if you're able to borrow an infinite amount of money, or let's just kind of go back. Let's say that you're able to borrow $1,000 from a friend, all right? And you're able to take that money, go to Vegas, double that money, you come back, and all you have to do is pay back your friend what you originally borrowed from them, okay? No interest. What sort of return did you generate? No. Infinite. Because you put none of your own money into the deal. Does that make sense? Okay, and that's probably the most fundamental concept whenever we're sort of talking about financial leverage that's extremely important. The whole idea is being able to borrow as much money as you possibly can, theoretically, to be able to fund a project. Now the downside of that is you still have to pay it back. Okay, so if you lose it, your loss can also be effectively infinite, all right, if that were to happen sort of over and over again. Anthony?
Now in a deal, how would you quantify your return if you have an equity partner that puts up all the cash and you as a developer develops it?
Then you're only going to look at it as just strictly a cash flow, because you can't really calculate a rate of return.
Okay.
You're simply going to look at it, here are the number of dollars that I'm receiving off of this deal.
Okay.
Now, you know, the majority of folks, whenever they are, you know, going in to make an investment or, you know, doing a development deal, they're going to contribute some portion of their equity. And the whole reason for sort of doing this sort of calculation and determining what that return on equity is to say, I could be putting that money elsewhere and doing something more productive with that money. But, you know, as I was saying before you got here, in a perfect world, a developer may be able to effectively structure a deal where they don't have to put any money into the deal. You know, and that's, you know, the perfect sort of scenario for a developer is to not have to put any money into a deal and being able to effectively then get, you know, an infinite rate of return.
I guess you would just look at it at the deal, for example, whatever the deal yields, you would look at.
Yeah, you would look at the, well, it's not even the yield, you would look at what is the cash flow that I'm going to be receiving.
Sure, just to stack it up against other deals, you would say this deal I could return 8% versus another one of 10%. That's how you would stack up, that's how you would see. Okay.
Because you ultimately want to be able to, yeah, compare one deal against another, and you know, those deal structures make it sometimes difficult to do that.
Right.
So this is why the normal convention to compare one project against another is to typically look at the net operating income, because that is sort of what the property is doing on its own before you start factoring in any of the financing,
Yeah.
any of the deal structuring, you know, whatsoever. And so that net operating income number is the number that tends to get focused on whenever we're looking at calculating the overall project return. So that would be the number that technically you're going to look at. Now, the only problem that you run into with that, we sort of kind of go back, and that's a good point to kind of bring up,
Appreciate it.
is, you know, we say we're using the net operating income number as the number to calculate the overall rate of return on the project. Normally that's going to be okay unless you have some sort of a deal structure set up to where maybe the developer, investor, partner, that sort of thing, gets paid fees
Right.
out of the operating expenses. That you may pay them a management fee or some sort of a development fee that, depending on how, once again, you kind of, you know, structure, you know, most of the time you don't want to do that, because that's going to deflate the net operating income number, making it look as though the project is not generating as much income as it should. So you're going to normally wait and pull out any sort of preferential returns or any sort of additional cash flows to the investors until you get down pretty much to this before tax cash flow number. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. But 99% of the time, you're going to use the net operating income number as the number to actually compare one project against another. Now, getting back to the financial leverage situation, all right, let's just sort of take a couple of scenarios, and what we're going to do is kind of apply the weighted average cost of capital model to these different scenarios. So we assume, let's say that we've got $100,000 that we are effectively we're going to need for a deal. Okay, and so we're going to call this our investment. And effectively, we're going to need to borrow a significant piece of this to actually do our deal. So let's just, to kind of keep the math reasonably simple, let's say that we're going to borrow 90%, and that's going to be our debt. Okay? So that means, effectively, out of that deal, we're going to be left with $10,000 equity in the deal. All right? Now, for this particular investment and this particular level of debt, we're going to have a cost of debt. And so let's say that our cost of debt for this particular situation is going to be 5%. So a 5% cost of debt. And let's assume that the duration for this investment is precisely 1 calendar year, okay? And the reason for that is because how we tend to calculate returns are on an annualized basis, okay? So assume that this occurs over 1 calendar year. Now, what is the return that the property may be throwing off, all right? Well, let's say that in this particular case, kind of going back to our REE model here for a second, that the income that the property generates is, let's say, $15,000 a year, and the value of the property we've established at being $100,000. That means that the cap rate or the overall return for this particular investment is 15%. Okay? So if that's the case, sort of look at it like this. At the end of the year, what do we have to do? We've got to effectively, the idea behind this is that we would sell this property at the end of the year, cash out of it, pay off our loans, take whatever proceeds and walk away, okay? Super simple sort of scenario here. So assuming that that's the case, if we sold the property at the end of the year for $100,000, we've got to pay back in this case, we've got to pay back our debt, which was $90,000. Okay. And we've also got to pay back our cost of debt, which was $5,000, or we call that our interest cost. All right. And when we do that, well, actually it'd be 40, oh, actually it wouldn't be 5,000, it would be 90,000 times 5%, 4,500. Okay. So 100,000 minus 90,000, 94,500 gives us $5,500. Okay, but is this really our profit? Well, no, because we also have to do what? We also have to take into consideration that we generated over the course of that year $15,000 of income, which would leave us with what, $20,500 effectively in our back pocket. So this is the amount that we have generated off of the property that we would get to keep as the equity investor. Yes? Okay. What was our equity investment?
10,000.
Okay, so we would take that 20,500, but we could also sort of look at it as, all right, out of that 20,500, did we really make the full 20,500? Well, no, we have to pay ourselves back 10,000 out of that, so we don't get to simply just divide it out. We need to go ahead and subtract out the 10,000. Let's do that first. And so we're left with 10,500 that we would legitimately say is our profit. Okay? And then we could take that 10,500, divide it by the 10,000 of equity, and that is going to give us our return on equity. Basically 105%, because we got back all of our money plus an additional $500, okay, on top of that. Does that make sense? Yep.
What is this? What does it say next to the 10,500?
Return on equity?
No, to the right.
Profit.
Oh, profit, okay.
Because once we have gotten back our total amount in terms of the income that the property generated, along with the leftover money effectively from after subtracting out our debt and our interest expense, this is what we're sort of left with. Okay? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing sort of about this is if we were to be able to do this over and over and over again, we'd make a tremendous rate of return year after year after year. And the idea is, are we better off in one sense borrowing the money or putting our own money, into this deal? Because had we simply paid cash for this investment, okay, and we borrowed no money whatsoever, our rate of return would have only been 15%. But because of the financial leverage and our really low cost of debt of only 5%, we're able to magnify our return on equity and get this 105% on every dollar that we personally have put into the deal. Does that make sense? Okay, Dustin?
Assuming that you have no other projects going on and no other deals in the pipeline, you'd be better paying cash because your net's going to be the actual cash in hand. It's
Okay.
going to be it's going to be $15,000 as opposed to $10,000.
Perfect
even though
segue.
you're-
No, perfect segue into the next piece of this, which is theoretically, if that is the case, and multiple projects like this exist at the beginning of the year, what you in essence could do is invest in multiple projects simultaneously using that
Right,
leverage.
right.
Okay, so that if you're saying that you only need 10,000 in equity, you could in essence do 10
Right.
projects instead of one. So if, like from a house building perspective, you could sort of look at this at the beginning of the year. Yeah, if I only had $10,000 cash and I borrowed 90,000, I could only build one house. Or I could, if I had $100,000 cash, I could just build one house, no debt. Or I could build 10 houses, each with a $10,000 equity investment, and magnify my portfolio dramatically, and then ultimately at the end of the year, I would end up with basically 10 times this dollar amount in profit. Does that make sense? So that's why so many people are clearly attracted to real estate as an investment, is because of this leverage opportunity that exists. And it's all driven by, and everything is assumed that you can get the lowest possible cost of capital from whoever your financial partner is. And that's what I'm saying at the very beginning of today is everything we've sort of done up to now in the real estate finance class has really been driven by being able to understand what is your actual cost of borrowing, okay? And the more that you understand all of the different components that go into calculating that cost of borrowing or the lender's yield, and trying to do what you can to minimize that cost of borrowing, that's only going to help inflate your overall rate of return because of the leverage that you're going to get off of that. Does that make sense? Okay, that's the reason why that is so important to understand how are all those different ways that a lender can sort of generate extra income, potentially eating away at your return as effectively a developer investor, and knowing that up front, to what extent maybe you are maybe in a better position to negotiate or certainly make a choice between different lenders or financial partners that are out there. Okay, make sense? Okay, any questions? Okay, all right, now, okay, one of the other concepts that, and once again, this is not going to be on this test, this is going to be on the next test, okay, because I did things a little bit differently, but one of the other concepts I know that some of you were struggling with, that is not on this test, but will be on the next test, but we need to go ahead and cover it, is net future value. And there is no net future value button on this calculator. Okay?
That was the question I was going to ask you.
No, it's kind of funny because probably a few years after this calculator was originally introduced, they introduced a more expensive model, and it does actually have a net future value sort of function to it. But it's not that difficult. All you do conceptually, this is kind of walk through the conceptual thing, and then we'll go through the calculations. All net future value is what dollar amount has been accumulated at some point in the future. Typically, it may be based upon a number of deposits that may not be even equal deposits each year. So that, for example, you want to achieve a certain maybe dollar amount in the future to replace a roof or something like that, and you kind of want to know how much you're going to have in that account, and you kind of have an idea of how much you need to have in that account, how much you need to set aside every month to kind of accumulate that, and so you can kind of approach it a couple different ways, but you may not be making the same deposit every single month or every single year, and so you may have to try to figure out, well, what is the interest it's earning on each of those deposits that will ultimately give you that net future value. The way you do it is you sort of trick the calculator, and what you do is you initially calculate the net present value of whatever those cash flow streams are. Once you've got the net present value, you're simply able to plug that in as your present value and then put in the appropriate interest rate and then solve for future value. That's all you got to do. It's that simple. Okay? So let's do it. All right. So let's say that we've got cash flows for the following years. And we have a discount rate, a rate of return, or investment rate, whatever we want to call it, or interest rate of 10%. All right? And we want to know what the net future value is for these cash flows at end of year 5. Okay, so we want to know how much all of these cash flows are going to be worth here at the end of year 5. Does that make sense, everybody? Now, we could just simply take, you know, to just test ourselves and kind of get some sort of a sense of reality and just go ahead and add those together to start us off. So 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, 25,000, and 30,000. So that gives us, we add all those up together, $100,000. So just from a check purpose perspective, we know that our net future value is going to be something greater than $100,000. Does that make sense? Because if we're earning 10% a year on each of these investments, then this number obviously is going to be greater than that. So what you're going to do to kind of put this into the calculator is as follows. It's going to be one payment per year. Yep, clear it all. So one payment per year. And then you're going to put 0 as your initial cash flow, because at time period 0, we're not expending anything, and so our first cash flow is not going to occur until the end of year 1. And so we'll put in 10,000 as our cash flow, 15,000 is the next one, 20,000, 25,000, and 30,000. And then you would simply put in 10% as the interest rate, and then solve for net present value. Okay, that's the first step. You get 72,216 and 87, 88 as our net present value. Okay, everybody good with that? Mm-hmm. All right. So what we're going to do now is Let's take that number, clear all, and we're going to put in 72,216.88 as our present value over 5 years, earning 10%, and solve for future value. And that will be our net future value. And so we end up with 116,306.01. So you can see, kind of going back to what I had said earlier, it's going to be something greater than the 100,000 because it's obviously earning interest each of those years. So the amount that you would actually have in the account at the end of that 5 years would be 116,306.01. Okay? Does that make sense, everybody? Any questions about that? Okay. All right, let's move on to another topic. Incremental cost of borrowing. You probably, whenever you were studying, you probably ran over this topic, but once again, it's not on this test, it'll be on the next test, okay? But if you did run across it, did any of you investigate what it was or just try to figure it out? Just out of curiosity? Nope? Wasn't that curious? Okay. All right. So what this concept basically boils down to is it's kind of the whole idea of packaging loans together and what your true cost of borrowing may be because of that packaging. And the easiest example I can give of this is as follows. Whenever you go in to get a residential mortgage, one of the things that traditionally you have been able to do is maybe get one loan for 80% of the property's value at one interest rate, and then get another loan for, let's say, 15% of the property's value at another interest rate, and then you have to put in, let's say, 5% equity. Okay, let's make sure I sort of illustrate this. So what I'm saying is that you may get one loan that's 80% sort of your loan to value ratio. You get another loan that's 15% loan to value ratio. Obviously, overall, you add that up. That's a total loan to value ratio of 95%. You put in 5% equity, and that gives you your overall sort of investment in the property. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, now, usually the cost of this 80% loan is less than the cost of this 15% loan. And usually this one is going to have priority. This one is going to be effectively, one way you can sort of look at this is like your first mortgage. This is your second mortgage. This one is the, if you want to call it the senior mortgage, this is the junior mortgage. A lot of different ways that you can kind of explain that. Now, the cost on this one might be, let's say, 5%. And the cost on this one, I don't know, we'll just throw out, maybe say it's 10%. So it could be, you know, dramatically more expensive than the first one. Right? Now, what is our weighted average cost of capital on that? Okay, if we're sort of trying to get a sense for what is the cost of those two loans sort of thrown together. In this case, we're talking about our weighted average cost of capital just on our debt, not on including the equity piece, but just on the debt piece, what is our cost? So what we would do is take the 80% times 5%, 15% times 10%, add those up, and that would be our weighted average cost of capital on just the debt piece. All right, so let's do that real quick. So once again, okay. So what you're going to find, taking 80% times 5%, 15% times 10%, you add those up, you get a 5.5% overall WACC or cost of debt. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. So what that means is a lender could say to you, I'm going to give you one loan for 95% loan to value for 5.5%, and that would be equivalent to what we've just described here. Yes? Yes?
Mm-hmm.
So what if I were to have said to you up front, well, I'll just give you one loan and I'll give it to you at 6%. Then you'd say, absolutely not. But chances are, before I just showed you this, you might have said yes. Because you might have said, well, 6% doesn't sound so bad because I'm having to pay 10% on this portion of the loan and you haven't really calculated the weighted average cost of capital. Do you follow what I'm sort of saying?
Yeah.
So this is yet another game that the lender can play, is by segmenting different loans or by packaging them together could make it look more or less attractive than what it might actually be. Okay? So as an example, let's just say that a lender out there was offering a 6% loan for 95% loan to value. What does that really mean that your incremental cost of borrowing would be on that extra 15%? We could kind of back into it, and get some sort of a sense, but what it's probably going to mean is it's going to be higher than this. You follow? If we're assuming this is held constant.
Right.
Okay? Because here's what could happen. Let's just kind of, erase this for a moment. You go into one lender, and they're telling you the most that we can lend on real estate loans is 80%. And our lending rate is 5% on those loans. And so for any additional money that you're going to borrow against this property, you're going to have to go to some other third-party lender to get that money. Okay? Which in many cases is going to be what's called mezzanine financing, or in this case, just simply getting a second mortgage on the property. All right? And as I've said, normally that's going to be at a much higher interest rate because they have a junior position in terms of any sort of default. These guys are going to be the first to get paid. Whatever's left over, these guys are going to get paid. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay? Everybody cool with this? All right, now, so let's work a problem and kind of show you another way to kind of get at some of this information. So let's say that we've got a $100,000 property, and in this particular case, we're going to go ahead and finance the whole thing. 80,000 of it is going to be financed, let's say, at a 4% interest rate for 15 years, and the or we're going to finance the entire 100,000 at 5% for 15 years. Whoops, 15 years, not 15%. So what I want you to do is to calculate the incremental cost of borrowing $20,000. Okay? So the setup is relatively simple. Over here, the overall project is still $100,000, but we're only borrowing or able to borrow $80,000 of that at 4% for a 15-year term, whereas this lender over here says we will allow you to borrow the entire $100,000 at 5% for 15 years. And what I'm asking you to do is to calculate what is the incremental cost of borrowing that additional $20,000. Does that make sense? Based on the kind of problem that we just went through. So the way that you're going to approach this is go ahead and calculate, start off with 80,000 as our loan amount, 4% interest rate for 15 years. Whoops. And let's get our payment amount. Versus over here, 100,000 as our loan amount at 5% for 15 years. And get our payment on that. Once again, 12 payments per year. Okay. All right, so now once we've got those two payment amounts, let's look at the difference between the two of them. Okay. It works to be $199.04. All right, so the way to sort of look at this is technically this additional amount of $199.04 is directly attributed to what? That extra $20,000 that we're borrowing, yes? Okay, so what we can do is plug this in as our new payment amount for the $20,000 loan amount for the 15 years, and then solve for what is the true cost of borrowing on that $20,000, or the incremental cost of borrowing. And what you end up with is 8.67%. So, my point, we kind of go back here for a second. Oops. No. The first loan is just the $80,000 and it's at 4%. Our second lender tells us we'll wrap everything together, all 100,000 at 5%, but if you do that, the real cost of borrowing that extra 20,000 is really 8.67%. Does that make sense? Okay. Now in this case, not a huge difference, but the point is still there of simply you need to understand how, in many cases, or why the lender does this. As you increase effectively the loan-to-value ratio, theoretically, a lender should be doing what? Increasing your cost of borrowing because they have more at risk. Now, I mean, just think about that for a minute. I mean, if you're a lender, you've got a property that's worth $100,000, wouldn't you think you would charge a lower interest rate if you only loaned out $80,000 versus loaning out $95,000 or $100,000? Of course you would, or theoretically you should, because the worst case scenario, if you only loaned out $80,000, is if the property goes into foreclosure, there's a greater chance you're going to get all that money back without any problem whatsoever, versus loaning out $95,000 or $100,000, in other words, full value of the property, if it goes into foreclosure, there's a greater chance you're not going to get all that money back, so therefore you should be charging a higher interest rate. But what doesn't always manifest itself in the mind of the borrower is what that true extra incremental cost is on borrowing that extra 10, 15, 20% if that amount gets rolled into just one master loan. Does that make sense?
Right.
So is the point of this, if you're looking at what you can do with that additional $20,000 and if, so help me finish this sentence. If with that additional $20,000 of my own equity,
In other words, the point being is, you could seek out, technically, another lender, and if that other lender, separate and apart from the first lender, was offering you an interest rate something equal to or less than 8.67%, you would take it.
okay,
Because that's a better deal than you're actually getting with the second lender all in. Okay?
Might be an equity partner too.
And it could be, could be an equity partner. Because in some cases, that amount is much more pronounced. You know, like for example, if we had said like, I don't know, 6.5 or 5.5, 6.5% for the second, you know, something greater than what we had put there, this number only gets more pronounced and it grows at a much higher rate because it's only a fraction of the overall loan. And so the point being is you could end up very naturally seeing this number be maybe 10, 15, 20%. And then all of a sudden you've got to be saying, well, is it really worth getting this package loan versus me going out and finding the money in some other way? Like, you know, almost like a cash advance kind of, you know, situation.
so would you relate this to your own, you know, ability to procure cash, so like a cost of equity?
Yeah, to a certain extent it is. I mean, and that this is effective, in that particular sense, you'd be saying that, you know, if you can get a much higher return on your equity elsewhere, then you're just better off borrowing.
Sure. Okay.
Would be another way to look at it. But you may not always have that choice. That's the thing. That in some cases you are mandated, you know, to put in that certain dollar amount of your money, you know, into the deal. But as you get into commercial loans, they care less and less about where that money comes from. You know, that it's more of, okay, can you find the funds from whoever? But it's also, and that's an excellent point to make, it's also part of the reason why most commercial loans tend to have a much lower loan-to-value ratio than residential loans. Because the lender is saying the only exposure I really want to have is up to 80% of the property's value, because if the thing blows up for whatever reason, I want to make sure that I'm able to get my, you know, money out of it. Now, obviously, you know, in the very recent history, you know, some lenders even went, you know, so far as to say, we're not going to do it at 80%, we're going to only put in 60%. because we're so paranoid about, you know, potentially values decreasing to a point that we want to absolutely make sure we get what we can out of the property. Whereas on the residential side, most of those loans are going to be backed by some sort of federal program that protects the lender in the event of a default. So they're willing in that case to loan a higher and higher and higher percentage of the property's value. Dustin?
No, it's,
I'll take your question, okay. All right, so does that make sense?
yes.
Okay, so it's, you know, what I'm trying to sort of get at with some of these things is that for you to have a little bit of a deeper understanding of kind of what these numbers mean, what is it the lender, you know, what are they getting out of the deal, what are you getting out of the deal, what are their motivations, what should be your motivations, you know, what are the kinds of pitfalls that you could potentially very easily sort of fall into that as a naive first borrower going into a deal, you know, your typical sort of approach is I'm going to go to whatever lender's going to give me the money. And, you know, you may be willing to sign away a lot of rights, a lot of additional cash flow, but the lender knows that, and the lender's, you know, sort of taking that and taking advantage of that situation, but you are almost just sort of so naive you have no idea of what you've really signed yourself up for. And that's part of the idea of kind of, you know, getting into this. But, you know, much broader than that, you know, after you start, you know, getting involved in deals that are obviously in the millions of dollars, you know, this whole thing of, it's amazing how much time and energy is spent chasing after the cheapest possible money. You know, and I can't stress that enough. You know, it's like shaving off a fraction of a percent, you know, on the financing becomes mission critical to, in some cases, making it a, you know, a go versus no-go sort of project. And so this, you know, whole business of saying what is truly my cost of borrowing on this thing really is important of, you know, getting that, you know, minor little difference in the cost. So, you know, it's that, you know, because, you know, most of us, you know, like on our, you know, sort of our personal level, you know, we may or may not get overly hung up on, is my car loan at a, you know, 3% interest rate versus a 5% interest rate, you know, doesn't inherently register with us, or, you know, is our credit card, you know, potentially interest rate 21% versus 18% or whatever it might be. But whenever you're starting to deal with something like this on a, you know, much larger, you know, sort of scale, you know, that fractional difference could be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars of just lost income just because you didn't take advantage of the least expensive form of financing. Okay. Okay, any questions? All right, let's take a quick break and come back in about 5 minutes. And what we're going to do is probably the questions for the test and that sort of thing, we'll hold those off until about 11, and then we'll start the test at 11:30, okay? I would just say, just, if you want to, just do your own thing.
Yeah, I'm not playing around, like, I'm struggling with like trying to get.
And then just, if you want to come time for the presentation portion, just do your portion. That's what I would suggest.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Right. Right. I mean, once again, just whenever it comes time to do the actual presentation, just present that.
President
Right.
said, yeah, the interest only stuff should be. Okay. Yeah, there's.
Florida State.
All I can say to you is, I'll do my best to try to take into consideration in the final grading. No, I understand. Right, right. Right, right, right. Right, I understand. No, I will promise you, I will take it all into consideration.
That's your interest for the first year.
Well, that's fine, you can.
I promise they solve it off of whatever it was.
I don't understand. I
That's
understand.
your behavior as if it were a normal loan. Yeah.
Right.
Your first payment is.
Right. No, I understand.
Right, so your first payment is.
Nope, I'm more than happy to have you, once again, submit everything separately if you want.
Yeah. Yeah. Then you, it's so principal, you take down the principal by.
That's fine, just submit all separately.
The second month.
Yep.
With that balance, you apply interest rate divided by 12. So your balance instead of 100,000 can be like 98, blah, blah, blah. And then times your interest rate divided by 12, that gives you your interest payment. I've never had a new interest payment plus that. Yeah, exactly. So man,
I'm on flash drive because it's got all the different types of mortgages.
That's a good question. Is there any sort of commercial mortgages out there that will give you like a 30-year amortization?
Sure.
Yeah.
And most of them are going to be on the CMBS side.
Yeah. You get a higher rate, but
You may end up with a lower rate, but it's just all the restrictions in terms of not being able to pay off early.
of the dollar
you could get. Because I wanted to make sure, like,
the compounding
thing, I
annual.
wanted to just make sure, like, my assumptions that because that changes things so dramatically.
As long as
Being able to
as long as my cap rate on
that sort of front or back that thing is going to tremendous because like I'm looking at things now and being able to quickly say, oh no, this is not going to work, you know. But that amortization period really changes things a lot based on whatever. It's a doable project.
Right.
I know,
Okay.
So you'll go over a couple of those questions that you have in there. You good, man?
Dr. Ford. How are you?
Is it okay if I push my exam? That's fine.
Yeah, we'll start at 11:30. Yep.
Yeah, future value, and whack. Yeah, that's it.
You studied too much, didn't you, Alyssa?
I just want to go to sleep.
Is there any chance you could take the exam early and then?
I'm
How does
gonna
lunch
rewatch
fit
the
into
whole
the
day.
day?
You basically, as soon as you finish the exam, you go to lunch, and then we start the second class at 2 o'clock.
So what if, do you have is there a time limit?
Well, technically 11:30 to 2 o'clock, so you skip lunch. It's an incentive for you to basically get out.
I'll be late with the 2 o'clock class.
Well, no, I mean, the exam should only take you an hour and a half to 2 hours at the most. So I mean, that's 11:30, so it'll be 12:30, 1:30, that's 2 hours.
Yeah.
And then you
It
get
took
30
me
minutes
like
for lunch.
3 days to do this
Yeah,
one.
that sounds painful.
Took me 3 days to do the old thing. I was thinking we were here all day doing that one.
I mean, Daryl took it on, I guess, 2 days ago, and he was done before 2 hours.
Who?
Daryl Ballou,
Oh, he-
Who's that?
because he had a funeral he had to go to yesterday, and was going to be gone through today.
How do you do?
He's okay.
What's his name? Yeah, why didn't you tell us that? I got the answer.
He's such a cheat, man.
That
He
is a
sucks.
cheat code.
He
It's
sucks.
Daryl Blue.
He sucks. You should have told us.
That's not being a team player right there.
Yeah,
You
we're
need
gonna
to
have to talk to this guy.
Yeah. Totally jokes.
After the test, of course.
What was that thing you were saying?
Thank you.
I mean, the reality is there's no surprises on the exam. It's everything we went over, everything we talked about, you know.
Surprised with all the stuff I tried to figure out how to do that what isn't on the exam. That was on the practice one.
Well, we haven't gotten to that yet.
I know, I'm like looking through my notes and then I tried to figure out how to do it myself.
Well, because I don't always teach it exactly the same every single semester.
No, of course, that's how any.
And sometimes we go faster, sometimes we go slower, sometimes we take things in different order. It's interesting for me.
I just went through your videos, and after like 10 questions, I tried to start answering them before you, and then kind of comparing, see how we did. First couple were a little off, but after a while, I got it.
I tried to figure them out, it took me a while, and then it was like, it becomes very repetitive.
Yeah, you're just finding those, plugging in what you know,
Plenty of
and
extras.
solving for the rest.
Okay.
After you solve prepayment, unless you're gonna pay it off in 5 years, instead of putting one and put 60, you can just put 60 in, and then,
So who are we missing out of this class? We're missing Daryl, we're missing Denville. There's one more person that's missing.
and then,
Or maybe, oh wait, oh, no. Okay, I didn't count it, she was out in the hallway. Okay, so we are,
you
we're
multiply that by your 1.3.
Yay.
Because not everybody's registered for this class, they're registered for the golf class. There's 14 people in this class. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14.
I think people should have took this one as opposed to, if this is your first year, you should have took this one as
I agree.
opposed to the development class.
But everybody shies away from this one in the investments class because of the numbers, but it's the mission critical piece that puts
I think
everything.
these two are the best classes to start on.
They are. That's the whole idea behind it, you know, but some people, they feel like, well, they may get a false start in the sense of fail these classes and not be able to do well. Okay, let us move forward. All right, let's talk about plans and graduated payment mortgages. Okay?
Plan?
So price level adjusted mortgages. Now, one of the things to sort of think about, we talked a little about this, you know, previously. There are a lot of different factors that influence the mortgage industry and the kinds of mortgages that are offered and the structuring of those mortgages and the effectively what those mortgages are attempting to accomplish for the lender and attempting to accomplish for the borrower. And these are two a little bit more obscure types of mortgages, not real prevalent now, were prevalent historically, and so you're going to sort of say, well, why are we going to talk about them? Because it's an interesting thing because of the structure of these and what they're attempting to accomplish. Part of what you should be doing, and part of what you should be thinking about, is whether you're the lender or whether you're the borrower, is to be thinking about the deal structure of the actual mortgages and how you might be able to be creative with those sort of deal structures and thinking about who gets paid, when they get paid, how much they get paid, is that payment going to change over time? You know, is it going to be, you know, purely interest? Is it going to be purely equity? Is it going to be, you know, constant? Is it going to be variable? You know, all of those are things that obviously are going to change, you know, for every sort of mortgage type and mortgage product. These two sort of merge with different goals in mind. We'll sort of start with the graduated payment mortgage. This is a mortgage also sort of called a stair-step mortgage, whereby your initial payments are really low. And then over time, as your income grows, so do the payments. Now, traditionally, these have been associated with the residential side of the business. There's nothing that precludes them from being used on the commercial side of the business, but just really haven't been, okay? Doesn't really mean they couldn't be. And I would argue that actually there's some wisdom to maybe even thinking about using them on the commercial side of the business. But the way that they would effectively be set up is this graduated payment mortgage, whoops, I can draw. So that over time, your payment, initial payment would start out here, and that payment would be good for a set period of time. Maybe a year, maybe 2 years, 5 years, whatever it might be. Then it would jump up automatically to the next level of whatever that payment is. Then it would jump up to the next level, and then ultimately it would sort of plateau at a certain level for the duration of the loan. Now, if you had gotten a normal mortgage, the normal mortgage might have been something like this, okay? In other words, in terms of a fixed payment up here, starting off, but then leveling out to a payment something less than what this one would have been ultimately. And if you sort of think about this, what's actually happening here is up front during this period of time, what's really occurring?
Lease up stage.
Well, lease up stage, or, you know, once again, your income is lower, but you're also sort of growing a deficit.
Right.
And from the lending, you know, sort of situation. That, in other words, because your payments are only here, and ordinarily they would be here on a normal mortgage, what's actually occurring here is probably negative amortization. Okay, meaning that you're actually accumulating a larger and larger balance on your loan for these first few years because you're not meeting that substantial enough payment in order to pay down the mortgage. Okay, and or you may be doing interest only. Okay, for those first few years, and then at some point, then you've got to start paying substantially more in order to make up for this deficit that has occurred here. Okay, so before we get into the mathematics of this, I want to get your opinions about, effectively, what do you think about this, conceptually?
This is great if your income early on is unsure, so you have a little bit more leeway.
Yeah, so that, once again, you're starting a business, or you're getting a property leased up, or you're, effectively on the residential side, you're starting out with your entry-level job, and you're hoping that you're going to get promotions, those sorts of things. And so this allows you to go ahead and qualify for the property that you can kind of grow into,
Right.
without necessarily having to replace it, like getting it's kind of like on the residential side, it's like, well, instead of getting a starter home, which is really all we can afford right now, we can go ahead and move into something a little bit more spacious and whatever, and not have to move again, a few years later, kind of thing. And the same sort of thing, kind of from a business perspective, could we, once again, start out by leasing space that we don't maybe currently need, but we, because of the way the market is, we kind of have to go ahead and lease it because it's contiguous to what we have.
Can those graduated payments be directly linked to some
Yes,
income or something?
absolutely could be. You know, so that you could say that as your income grows, or as your rental income grows, or whatever it might be, your payment actually would grow as well. And, you know, so that you could have effectively a percentage, you know, kind of sales, or, you know, something that's tied to basically what that payment is. Now, historically, the way that these graduate payment mortgages have worked is that, you know, we've kind of set up effectively, you know, and kind of fixed what those payments are going to be, you know, at each of these levels. And so, you know, we could say, I'm just going to throw some numbers out here just to, you know, this might be $500 a month, this might be $600 a month, $700 a month, you know, $800 a month. Okay, now obviously we could add some zeros onto that, you know, once again for larger property, but what we're sort of saying is that in one sense, or we could get a mortgage that it's a fixed rate mortgage of, you know, almost $700 or right at $700 that's fixed rate, but yet can we really afford that up front? Okay, because now here's another aspect of this that on the residential side that you may not really think about. What is the most common thing that a lot of lenders, well, you're probably more familiar with it on the car dealership side. What is, whenever you go in to buy a car, what is usually the very first thing that they ask you?
Do you rent or do you?
What payment do you want, or what's the biggest payment you can afford?
Right.
Okay? That's pretty much how this model works, is the whole idea of we're sort of back solving and sort of saying, all right, you come in and you tell me, or I have determined based on your credit score, earning, you know, income, you know, that sort of thing, the most that you can afford is $500 a month. So therefore, I'm going to set you up in a loan that basically for that $500 a month, but I'm going to make, in this particular case, I'm going to make the expectation that your income is going to grow significantly over the next several years. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's say that, I don't know, we'll say this is good for 3 years, another 3 years, 3 years, that's, so 9 years, so what, 21, we'll make this a 30-year mortgage, so 21 years. Okay, so 30 years altogether. Okay. Everybody good? All right, now, so assume that this is the case, so for each of these years, that's going to be our mortgage, our monthly mortgage payment. Now, there's a couple different ways that we can kind of look at this, and we can kind of, depending on what it is we're trying to actually solve. Because we could also sort of say, well, all right, given this sort of a payment schedule, what is the maximum loan amount that we could actually afford? What would be the equivalent, basically, fixed rate mortgage? Would be one thing we might want to solve for. Yes? Okay. So how would we approach that?
You put those in as cash flows?
Yep.
It's all for the net present value?
Yep. It's exactly what you would do. That effectively, you put all of these in as cash flows over that 30-year period, and then ultimately put in whatever the interest rate is, because we're going to make the assumption in this particular instance that the interest rate is going to be the same possibly for this as it is for this, but it may not be. But if it is, and we say that the interest rate is 5%, so we put this in as cash flow for basically 36 months, this one in as cash flow for 36 months, this one is a cash flow for 36 months, and then this one is a cash flow for, well, 21 years times 12 months, and then ultimately come back and say, well, at a discount rate of 5%, what is the value of that, effectively that series of cash flows. And then that would be the equivalent loan amount on a potentially fixed rate mortgage for 5%. Does that make sense conceptually to everybody, yes or no? Okay, now let's see if we can do it. So, what we're saying, 12 payments per year. I get to show you a little trick on the calculator. All right, first thing, 0 is going to be our initial cash flow since nothing is occurring at time period 0. And our first cash flow is going to be $500 a month for 36 months, so 36 shift in sub j. Our next cash flow is $600 as a cash flow for 36 months. Next one is $700 a month for 36 months. And then we're at $800 a month for the remainder. Now, before you put in that next piece, because you're gonna have the calculator is gonna go crazy because it doesn't like it. I'll explain why. The calculator is limited to one weird thing, and that is the most consecutive cash flows that you can put in at one time is 99. Okay, it's not a problem. You can still do this, and all you have to do is to break it up into components smaller than 99. Okay, so that $800 cash flow is occurring, we said, for 21 years times 12 months a year. That's a total of 252 months, correct? Yes?
Yes.
All right. Now, all we have to do is, subsequent to this, we have to put in the number of times that $800 cash flow occurs. But I said, this number here can never exceed 99, just because the calculator won't accept it, okay? So what I typically do is do this calculation to find out how many total months, and then you can do it one of several ways. One way that I do is to see, well, if I divide this by like 3 or 4 or 5, then can I effectively put it in that many times each? And so in this one, what I might just say randomly is, well, let's divide that by 3. And when I do, 252 divided by 3 is 84 months at a time. So I can put in the 800 for 84 months, then put in the 800 again for another 84 months, and then put in the 800 again for the final 84 months. And then once I've done that, put in the interest rate of 5%, and then solve for net present value, and we've got our answer. Okay, so let's see what we get. Get 130,796. Is that what you get? Yes?
Yeah.
Yes.
796, 83. So what this is telling us is this stair-step kind of graduated payment mortgage would be the equivalent of us getting a normal mortgage of $130,796.83 over that same time period. So what we can do now is take that $130,796.83, put that in as our present value for 30 years at 5%, and find out what the actual payment would be for the normal mortgage. Let's see how close we get here. $702.15. All right, well, if you look back, I was pretty close to my guess, wasn't I?
Oh yeah.
Okay, right around 700 bucks. Okay, make sense? Pretty cool. Now, can you think of any downsides
If
to
your
this?
income, if your income doesn't rise.
Bank, like some of your information, is your projected.
Yes, obviously, I mean, if we're looking at this from a commercial perspective, you would need to be sharing with the lender a lot of information about your potential operating, prospects. In one sense, they're kind of almost going into business with you, because to a certain extent, what's actually happening in this first, couple of years or first 6 years is you're running at a deficit. You're not obviously generating enough income to substantiate the loan. So the lender's got to be, first of all, they've got to feel comfortable that the value of the property is substantially high, that if they had to foreclose, that they could still potentially cash out at a level greater than 100, hopefully 130,000.
How do you estimate, like, suppose you have like a performance requirement for the bank? I mean, how do you project that in the future? Just assuming a lot of.
It's a lot of assumptions. No, I mean, there's nothing magical about it. It's a situation of, you could say, once again, is what Mark was saying, this could be based on like lease up of a property that, you anticipate that within, it's going to take you, for whatever reason, and, obviously 6 years is a long time, but, you could say that it might take you a couple of years easily to achieve full lease up on this property, because of the market that's located in it, and that maybe one of the things that's keeping lease up from occurring instantly is some sort of project that has yet to be built elsewhere, that this project is somewhat maybe dependent upon. Or, obviously, like if you're building a resort development, you don't have all the pieces maybe built that are going to substantiate the cash flow necessary to kind of move it forward. And so there's a lot of different, I guess, ways that you can kind of think about this, but the general idea is simply that you're able to go ahead and get qualified for this mortgage up front with an income that is less than you're really going to need later on in order to substantiate it. Okay, Robert, did you have either a question or a comment, I thought?
No, but something just popped up. So as a scenario, if you were in that circumstance where there's a particular building that we're waiting to, or a project that we're waiting to get done, and we get put onto this situation, will we also tell our leases to maybe step up as well? So that we can make sure that we're getting those payments by that time?
Yeah, I mean, because you could structure your leases, in such a way, because a lot of times, especially with retail property, and I'm sure Anthony can back up on this, is that if, like for example, your center has not achieved a certain level of occupancy, you may have lease provisions in place, the tenants don't pay their full rent. Because the thought process is, if the center is not full, it maybe doesn't have the same drawing power that it would once it's full, and that also there's a perception thing there as well. That if it's empty or substantially empty, our customer's going to be somehow turned away, you know, or they're going to, well, not go to the center because they think, well, it's not fully active, or there's, you know, issues there that could be problematic or whatever, and so the retailer, you know, may be not able to collect the full rents for the first few years or a couple of years until it